Lakota chief, was misjudged by every white town. A banished widow stood beside him and wed. I have held this pipe for 43 years, and I have never told this story to a white man. I'm telling it now because there is a photograph on the table in front of me, faded brown at the edges. The paper gone soft the way old things go. And in that photograph is a woman standing beside me, in front of a cabin door. She has her hand on my arm, not holding it for balance, not resting it there the way a person rests a hand on a fence post. She has her hand on my arm the way a person holds something they intend to keep. That photograph was taken in the autumn of 1882. I was 41 years old. She was 34. We had been married 7 weeks. Her name was Cecilia Marsh, though she went by Cece. She came from Ohio originally, before the frontier swallowed everything Ohio had made her. By the time I met her, she had been banished from 2 towns, one in Kansas, one in the Nebraska Territory, and she carried herself like a woman who had stopped expecting anything from towns. My name is Chayton Eagleheart. I was head man of a small Lakota band, not a war band, not a raiding party. Just 60-some people trying to live in a world that had decided, around 1,875 or so, that we were supposed to stop existing. We were not on the reservation. That is a longer story, and I am not going to tell it today, except to say that we had reasons, and the reasons were good, and I would make the same choice again. But this story is not about what the government was doing to my people. Every story I could tell is about that, underneath everything. But this one I want to hold close to what happened between me and Cece in the year 1882, and let the rest of it sit at the edges where it belongs. I want to tell you about a door. The door belonged to a general store in a town called Harwick, which sat in the flat bottom of a river valley in southeastern Wyoming Territory. The door was painted red once, but the red had dried and cracked and peeled until what was left was more gray than anything, just a ghost of red in the grain of the wood. There was a nail at eye level where somebody had hung a wreath once, and the wreath was gone, but the nail stayed, bent slightly to the left. I remember that nail because I was looking at it when the door shut in my face. We needed flour, salt pork, lamp oil if they had it. My second, a man named Gall on the Wind, we called him Gall, most of the time had ridden ahead the day before and come back and said the store in Harwick would trade, that the man behind the counter was reasonable, that there had been no trouble. Gall had a way of reading white towns quickly, the way a person reads weather, and I trusted his read. But Gall had gone in wearing a canvas coat and a hat he'd bought off a traveling salesman, and he looked not white, exactly, but not precisely what people out here meant when they said Indian. I went in looking like what I was. I did not own a canvas coat. I wore what I wore, which was what my people wore. And I walked up to that red door, and I put my hand on it, and I pushed it open, and a bell rang above my head. And the man behind the counter looked up from his ledger, and his face went through 5 things in about 1 second. And the last thing it landed on was a particular kind of hard blankness, and he said, "We don't serve your kind here." I had heard that sentence or sentences shaped exactly like it many times. You would think you would get used to it. You don't. It is not that it hurts the same way each time. It changes shape. Sometimes it lands like a slap. Sometimes it lands like something you already knew was coming. And the knowing and the landing are both bad in their separate ways. That day in Harwick it landed like a stone dropped into deep water, no splash, just a descent, and then quiet. I said, "I have coin." He said, "I don't want your coin." I said nothing else. I turned and I walked back through the door, and it shut behind me, and I stood on the porch of that store in Harwick, Wyoming Territory, in the late morning of a Tuesday in July, and I looked at the nail in the door and thought about 60 people who needed flour. I didn't hear her come up behind me. I heard the step on the board, that particular creak, and then there was a woman beside me on the porch looking at the same gray door, and she said, "Harwick." She said it the way a person says a word they've been chewing on for a while, and have finally decided to spit out. She said, "They ran me out of this town 8 months ago." I looked at her. She was a lean woman, sharp-boned, with light brown hair going to gray at the temples and eyes that were a particular shade of dark green that I would spend years afterward trying to describe accurately and never quite manage. She was wearing a dress that had been washed so many times the blue in it was nearly gone. And she had a flour sack over one arm and a list in the other hand, and she was looking at the door the same way I was looking at it, which was the way you look at something that has already told you what it is and has nothing left to show you. "What did you do?" I asked her. She laughed. Not meanly. It was a short laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere tired. "I married a man they didn't think I should marry," she said. "And when he died, they decided I didn't deserve to stay." "What kind of man?" She looked at me then, straight on. "A Mexican man," she said. "His name was Vicente Marsh. He was a good man and a good husband, and they hated him from the day he arrived, and they hated me for choosing him." She said it flat, not performing the pain of it, just the facts, set out like tools on a workbench. I looked back at the door. "They won't sell to you either?" "They'll sell to me," she said. "They'll let me spend my money and they'll look at me the way they're looking at me, and I'll take my flour and my salt and I'll ride back to my homestead, and that'll be that." She paused. "I didn't come over here to complain about it. I came over here because you looked like a man who needed something from that store, and I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought if you told me what you needed, I could go in and buy it, and you could pay me back whatever I paid." I looked at her a second time. She was looking at me without any of the things white people usually put in their eyes when they look at me. Not the performative blankness of someone trying to look like they weren't afraid. Not the aggressive, studied blankness that is its own kind of hostility. "Why?" I said. She thought about it. "Genuinely, I mean, the way a person thinks about an answer, rather than reaching for the first thing that sounds right. Because it's wrong," she said. "And because I know what it feels like to want something you should be able to have, and be told no for no reason that has anything to do with what you deserve." I told her what I needed. She went in and bought it and came out, and I paid her, and I loaded the goods onto the pack horse. She stood there while I tied the load, and when I was done, she said she was riding back to her homestead, which was 7 miles south and east along Cotter Creek. And she said it the way a person says something they wanted to say but weren't sure they would. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "It wasn't unkind. That man in there sold you something today. He just doesn't know it yet." She got on her horse and she rode south. I watched her go until the distance made her small. I want to tell you what it meant to be me in 1,882 inches southeastern Wyoming territory. Because without that, what Cisse did won't mean what it means. I was the son of a chief and the grandson of a chief, and I had been made headman of my band at 33 years old because our previous headman, my uncle, I was killed at the Greasy Grass in 1876, what you call Little Bighorn. I was there. I will say nothing more about that day, except that I was there, and afterward the world was different, and not only because Custer was dead. After 1876, the Army came for everyone. Some of my people went to the agency. Some scattered. I took our band, what was left of it, and moved east, and then north, and then east again, following the patterns of game, avoiding the patterns of soldiers, trying to find a way to live that was not dying. We had 63 people, including children. By 1882, we had been doing this for 6 years. 6 years of knowing that the moment a soldier saw us, he saw a threat. 6 years of riding into white towns and being read as dangerous. 6 years of being the thing the newspaper stories were about, the thing the politicians were talking about when they talked about the Indian problem, the thing that needed to be solved. I was not always able to be what I knew myself to be in those years. When you are seen a certain way long enough, there are moments, I will say this plainly, because I think it is true. and because I think men who are 65 years old have heard enough truth to handle a little more. There are moments when the being seen starts to put a kind of weight on who you are, not because you believe what they believe about you, but because carrying it is its own thing, separate from whether it's true. I knew who I was. Headman, provider, competent at the things that mattered. Reading land, reading weather, reading people, deciding when to move and when to stay, keeping my people fed and as safe as a people can be kept when the whole apparatus of a government has decided they should not exist. I knew all that. I knew my worth. And still, there were nights in those 6 years when the accumulated weight of every shut door, every hard look, every hand that went to a gun when I rode into a town, there were nights when that weight sat on me like a stone, and I lay awake listening to my people sleep and wondered what it was going to cost to keep going. I'm telling you that so you understand what it was to have a woman look at me the way Cece Marsh looked at me on that porch in Harwick. Not like a problem. Not like a threat. Not even like an object of pity. Like a man. 3 weeks after Harwick, one of my hunters found a dead horse on the flat above Cotter Creek. Not killed by a predator, the horse had broken a leg in a prairie dog hole, and whoever was riding it had shot it, which was the right thing to do, and then had started walking, which was the only thing to do, and then had apparently fallen, which was the thing that had gone wrong. The horse was 2 days dead. There was a woman's saddle on it. My hunter knew the saddle. We found Cece Marsh 1/2 mile south, in a dry wash, unconscious and fever-hot, with a broken arm and a gash on her head, where she'd hit something going down. She'd managed to crawl into the wash, which kept the wind off her. And she'd managed to tie a strip of her skirt around her head to stop the bleeding. But she hadn't been able to do much else, and she was 2 days into the fever when we found her. We brought her back to our camp. I want to stop here for a moment and say something about my people, because I have heard what people out here say about us, and most of it is wrong in ways that make me tired. We were not the things they said we were. We were people. We had healers and teachers, and people who were good at particular things, and people who were not good at those things, but were good at other things. We had old women who remembered everything, and young men who thought they knew everything, and children who were somewhere between the two. We had people who were kind, and people who were difficult, and people who were quietly extraordinary. One of the quietly extraordinary people was a woman named Stanzen River, who was our healer, and was 70 years old that year, and who had kept more people alive than I can count. Stanzen River set Cece's arm, cleaned the wound on her head, brought the fever down over 2 nights with medicines I could not name in English, and then sat beside her for a 3rd night because the fever spiked again, and Stanzen River did not leave a person alone when the fever spiked. Cece came through it. On the 4th day she opened her eyes, and I was there. I had been checking on her every few hours, which I told myself was the responsible thing a headman does when a white woman is in his camp, knowing full well there was something else in it too. And she looked at me for a moment, the way a person looks when they are coming back from somewhere far. And then she said, "The chief with the hard face." I said, "You're going to live." She said, "I know." Said it like a fact, like she'd already decided. Then she looked at the walls of the lodge around her, and she said, "How long?" 4 days. She was quiet. Then, "Your healer saved me." She did. I'd like to thank her. You'll have time to do that. She looked at me again, that straight-on look she'd had on the porch in Harwick. You could have left me in that wash. I said nothing. Most would have, she said. Most would have, I agreed. We're not most. She had to stay with us another 10 days while the arm knit enough to travel, and while she got her strength back. Those 10 days changed something. Not dramatically, not the way stories sometimes make things change. In a rush, in a revelation. Slowly. The way light changes in a room when the clouds move. She sat with Stanzen River, and they talked through my nephew, who had some English, about medicine, about plants, about the things a person can do for a broken body with what the land provides. Stands in River, who was not a woman given to displays of any kind, told me one evening that the white woman asked good questions. From Stands in River, that was considerable. She sat with the children in the evenings, not in a performing way, not in the way white people sometimes sit with Indian children, like they are looking at something exotic. Just sat with them the way you sit with children. When you like children, she knew a game with string that one of the older girls took a shine to, and the girl learned it and then taught it to two others, and that kept going for days after Cece could walk again. I talked with her. Not about deep things, not at first. About the land we were on, which she knew well from 6 years of homesteading, about water sources and winter cover and the places the game moved in different seasons. She knew the land the way a person who has had to survive on it knows it practically, with respect, without romance. She told me about a canyon to the east that had a spring in it that ran even in August, and that turned out to be true, and it helped us that winter. On the 6th night she asked me about my people. How we came to be here. What had happened after 1876. I told her the shape of it, not the whole weight of it. Because the whole weight of it is not something you put on a person in one sitting. She listened, without filling in the silences. There is a kind that of person who cannot sit in a silence without rushing to put something in it, and she was not that kind. She let what I said sit, and then she said, "I'm sorry." Not in the way people say it when they mean they're embarrassed about something. I mean, I'm sorry that was done to your people. I looked at the fire. It's still being done, I said. I know, she said. I'm sorry about that too. We sat there a while. On the 10th day, she said she was strong enough to ride and I had a horse she could borrow to get back to her homestead. She stood outside my lodge in the early morning, and she shook my hand, not a performative shake, a real one, firm, like a person making a promise, and she said, "Chayton Eagleheart," first time she'd used my name. "I won't forget what your people did for me." "Stands in River," I said. "Don't forget her name." She smiled. It was the first time I'd seen her smile fully, not the short, tired laugh from the porch. It changed her face considerably. "Stands in River," she said. "I'll remember." She rode out south. I watched her go again. And I stood there, longer than I needed to. I'm going to tell you about the thing that happened in September, because it is the thing that made everything else possible, and I don't want to skip over it the way a man skips over the part of a story that cost him something. There was a man in that part of Wyoming territory named Aldous Creel. He ran cattle on the flat north of Cotter Creek, about 4,000 head, a big operation, and he had hired men to run it who were the kind of hired men that a certain kind of cattle baron hires. Capable, and rough, and not overly concerned with lines on maps that weren't drawn to their benefit. Creel had been pushing west and south, the way big outfits push, a little at a time. He'd already absorbed 2 smaller ranches legally. If you use the word loosely, he'd had his eye on Cece Marsh's homestead for a year. The land sat on a good stretch of the creek with reliable water, and Creel wanted it. When Cece had gone back to her homestead in August, she'd found that Creel's men had pulled 3 of her fence posts, which was a message. She'd put them back. 2 weeks later they'd pulled 7, and salted a section of her pasture, which would kill the grass. She'd put the posts back and plowed under the salted section, and planted it with something that would survive the salt. Then Creel had ridden over himself, which meant he was done with messages and starting on the next thing. I know all this because she told me. She rode to our camp in the 3rd week of September, with a split lip and a look I recognized, not fear. Exactly, but the thing underneath fear. The thing that has gotten past fear and arrived somewhere colder. She told me Creel had come to her door with 2 of his men and told her the offer was $500 and she should take it while it was on the table. She'd told him no. One of the men had grabbed her arm and she'd hit him with an iron pot she was carrying, and it had broken his nose and they'd left, but she knew they'd come back. I asked her what she wanted from me, Directly. I asked because I had learned, over years, not to assume what a person wants, and also because I was not sure what I had to give her, and I needed to know if it was what she needed. She thought about it. That same genuine thinking. Then she said, "I want to know if you'd let me winter my stock with yours on that canyon spring you told me about. If I can move the cattle and get off the property before Creel comes back, there's nothing for him to take. The land is filed legal with the Territorial Land Office. He can't get the land if I'm still paying the filing fee." I asked her how she'd get back to her property in the spring. She said she'd worry about spring in spring. I said yes. Of course I said yes. She had good stock. 6 cattle, 4 horses, a dozen sheep, and an extra dozen cattle would not hurt us, and 4 horses would help. And she was a person who knew the land and knew how to work and would not be a burden, and I thought, I will admit to what I thought. At 68 years old, in front of a photograph, I can admit it, I thought I was glad to have a reason for her to be there. She moved to the canyon spring in early October with her stock and the things she could carry. She built herself a lean-to against the south wall of the canyon. Good, thick walls. A solid roof. I watched her build it. She asked for help once, when the roof beam needed lifting. And that was the only time she asked. Stands in River started teaching her things. Plants, medicines, the particular knowledge of how to winter in this kind of country that you don't get from homesteading alone. Cece learned fast. Stands in River's opinion of her went up steadily, and Stands in River's opinion of anyone going up was a notable thing. My nephew translated between them for a while. Then he didn't have to. Cece had some Lakota words by November. She had more by December. I don't know how she did it. I know she sat with people and listened a great deal, and she was not embarrassed about making errors, and she didn't perform her learning to make people admire her for it. She just learned. By the depth of winter, she could say most of what she needed to say, and people could say most of what they needed to say back to her. And that was not a small thing. We worked together through the cold months, checking the stock, tracking game, managing the things that need managing when 60-some people are trying to get through a Wyoming winter. She was capable in the ways that matter, not showy capable, not proving herself capable, just quietly, consistently useful. She knew what needed doing, and she did it without waiting to be asked. My people respected that. It's one of the things we respect, actually, because it is rare. A person who sees what needs doing and does it is worth more than a person who can explain why it should be done. There was a night in January cold that comes right through the walls, the kind that makes the animals quiet because even moving uses warmth they can't afford, when a young man in our band got into serious trouble. His name was Sleeping Bear, and he was 22, and he'd gone out to check on the horses in what had looked like a break in the weather, and the break had closed up again fast, and he'd gotten turned around in the dark and the cold, and been out 4 hours before we knew he was missing. We went out after him in 2 groups. I took the north side of the canyon. Cece went with the second group, south. They found him. She found him. Specifically, she nearly walked into him. She said, he was on the ground in a hollow behind a rock shelf, and if she'd been 2 feet to the left, she'd have missed him. She dragged him back 170 pounds of young man. She dragged him, and she was lean and strong, but not large. She dragged him 50 yards to where the others could help, and then helped carry him the rest of the way back to camp. He lived. His feet had some frost, but he walked on them all his life. The next day, Stands in River said something to me. I'll translate it as close as I can. She said, "That woman. She doesn't think about whether to help. She just helps." I said I knew. Stands in River looked at me for a moment the way she sometimes looked at people when she was deciding whether they knew what they thought they knew. Then she went back to her work. I want to tell you about a night in February. There's a moment in winter, somewhere in the deep part of it, where you stop fighting it and you start living in it. The cold becomes the condition of things, rather than a thing being done to you. I don't know how to say it better than that. Cece and I were checking the south end of the herd in the evening, and we stopped because there was something in the sky. I don't know the word in English. The lights that sometimes appear in winter, the green and white lights that move. My people have names for them. She stopped and she looked up and she said, I saw these once when I was a girl in Ohio, but not like this. The lights were considerable that night. We stood there in the cold, both of us tilted back looking up at them, and she said, without looking at me, Chayton. She had stopped using the full name by then. Are you happy? It was a strange question. People don't ask it directly, usually. There is something uncomfortable about it being asked straight. I thought about it. In this moment, I said, yes. She looked at me then. The lights were behind her, moving slow and green. Not just this moment, she said. In general. With your life. I took a long time with that one. My life has been what it has been, I said. I don't know if happy is the word. I know that I am where I am supposed to be. I know that the people I am responsible for are still alive. I know that I have not betrayed what I was given to carry. I looked at her. That is what I have. Mostly. That, and this winter. She was quiet. What about you? I said. She looked back up at the lights. I've spent years being angry, she said. Not at Vicente. Not at my life with him. At what happened after. At the way people. She stopped. Then. At the way people decide what you are, and make you live inside that decision. I knew that thing. This winter, she said. Your people have not done that to me. No, I said. You haven't done that to me. No. She turned and looked at me fully. And the lights were still moving behind her. And she said, I want you to know that I see you. Who you actually are. Not what Harwick decided you were, not what the newspapers say, not what the army says. I mean, I see you, the man. I could not find anything to say. That is not a thing that happens to me often. I wanted to say it, she said, because I think someone should have said it a long time ago. The lights went on for another hour. We watched them until we got cold enough that we had to move, and then we walked back to camp, and she went to her lean-to, and I went to my lodge. And I lay there for a long time in the dark thinking about what she had said. In 30 years of being a headman, a son, a husband, my first wife died in 1878. I will say that plainly. Her name was Morning Cloud. And she died of fever. And I will always carry that. In all of those years, no one had ever said exactly that. Seen you. The man. She had said it like a fact. Not trying to give me something. Just reporting what she saw. In March, Aldous Creel found out where we were. I had known it was possible. Creel had men who rode wide and asked questions. And a Lakota band wintering in a canyon with a white woman's homestead stock was something people would eventually mention in towns. I had known it was possible, and I had laid out 3 lines of decision in my head for when it happened. What I had not laid out, exactly, was Creel riding in with 9 men and a territorial deputy, and a paper he said gave him the right to remove us. I am not going to tell you what was on that paper. I have seen enough papers in my life to know that what is written on them and what is true are not always the same thing. And I am not going to give that paper more dignity in this telling than it deserved. What I will tell you is that the deputy was a man named Holloway, who had the look of a man doing something he knew was wrong but had found reasons to do anyway, which is a look I have seen many times, and which I find more troubling than outright malice, because malice at least has the integrity of meaning what it does. Creel read the paper. His men sat their horses with their rifles across their saddle fronts. Not raised. Just present. I let him read it. I stood there in front of the assembled leadership of my band, all of them behind me. And I let him read every word. When he was done, he held it out to me, and I looked at it without taking it. I said, "This paper gives you permission to remove a Lakota band that is camping illegally on federal land. We are in a canyon that was ceded to my people in 1868 under the Fort Laramie Treaty, which is still the law of the United States, whether convenient or not. Creel said the treaty had been superseded. I said it had not been superseded in the portion that included this canyon. He said his lawyers said different. I said his lawyers were not here, and the treaty was. We went around on it for a while. Holloway was watching me in a way that was not hostile exactly, but was very careful. The way a man watches something he is genuinely trying to understand, rather than merely manage. That was the first thing I saw that told me today might go different. Then Cece Marsh came and stood beside me. She had walked out from behind the line of my people, and she stood at my left shoulder, and she looked at Creel, and she said, "Mr. Creel." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, that was confusion first, and something uglier second. "Those 6 cattle and 4 horses and 12 sheep in this canyon are mine," she said. "My homestead filing is current with the Territorial Land Office. My attorney in Cheyenne," she said, the name of an attorney in Cheyenne, "will be interested to know that you sent men to my door in August, and that one of those men laid hands on me." She paused. "He'll also be interested in the dates of your acquisitions on Cotter Creek and the methods you used." Creel said, "Mrs. Marsh, I'm not finished," she said, without raising her voice. "Chief Eagleheart has told you about the Fort Laramie Treaty. I will tell you one more thing. I am going to ride to Laramie City in the spring, and I am going to tell everyone I can find what has been done to this band of people. I am going to tell newspapers. I am going to tell the Territorial Governor's office. I am going to tell anyone who will hold still long enough to listen." She looked at him without blinking. "You can do what you want today, Mr. Creel. But I promise you that what you do today is going to cost you considerably more than one canyon spring." Holloway said, "Creel." Creel looked at Holloway. Holloway said, "I'm not going to be part of removing a band that's on treaty land, based on a paper I'm not sure about." He said it quietly, like a man deciding something he'd been deciding for a while. "You want to push this, get a federal judge, and come back." Creel sat there on his horse for a long moment. Then he turned and rode out, and his men rode with him. Holloway paused before he followed. He looked at me. "Chief," he said. He nodded once. Then, he rode. I stood there in the canyon with my people behind me and Cece Marsh at my left shoulder, and I watched them go. The canyon was quiet except for the sound of horses moving away down the draw, and then that faded, and then it was just the creek and the wind. I did not look at her right away. I looked at the place the riders had gone until they were gone, and then I looked at the far wall of the canyon, and then I looked at my people, who were looking back at me. And then I turned, and I looked at Cece Marsh. She was already looking at me. She had been looking at me, I think, since the moment Creel rode away. I said, "Thank you." She shook her head, the same way she'd shaken it on the porch in Harwick, not dismissing it, refusing the framing. "You had it," she said. "You were going to hold it." He might not have left. "He was going to leave," she said. Holloway was already there. I looked at her for a long moment. "You were prepared," I said. "You'd thought about what you'd say." She said, "I've been thinking about it since October." And that was the thing. That was the thing that I had not known, that she had been watching and understanding and thinking all through the winter about what was coming and what she could do. Not because anyone asked her to, not because it benefited her, because she was a person who, when she stood somewhere, I held out my hand and she took it, and I held it for a moment, both of us standing in the mouth of the canyon with the creek running behind us and my people around us. And then I let go and said, "Come have food." She came and had food. There are things about that spring I want to tell you, and things I am going to leave private. I will say that the distance between two people can change its nature gradually. So, gradually, you don't always see it happening. And then there is a morning or an afternoon when you see clearly that what was between you has become something different. And the question is, what you do with that. I did not want to do anything wrong by her. That was my first thought. Not what I wanted, but what was right. She was a woman who had already been made to pay too high a price for her choices. I was a Lakota chief in 1882, which meant that anything she chose with me would cost her something in the world outside this canyon. I was not going to ask her to pay that price on my account without understanding fully what she was choosing. I told her that, directly. In early April, when the snow was going off the high ground and the canyon was starting to green, I told her what I felt and what I was concerned about and what I thought she should know before she decided anything. She listened. When I was done, she said, "Chayton, I have been banished from 2 towns. I have been a widow of a man nobody thought I should have married. I have been called every name that kind of woman gets called. I have been alone on a homestead for 3 years without a neighbor who would speak to me directly." She looked at me. "What you're describing as a cost, I've already paid most of it, and the part I haven't paid yet, I'm not afraid of." She let that sit. Then she said, "The question I've been asking myself is whether you want me. Not whether you should. Whether you do." I said, "I do." She nodded once. "That's what I needed to know," she said. "We married in June, in the way of my people first, and then in the way of the law. We rode to Laramie City and found a justice of the peace who, to his credit, did not comment on the particulars of us and did his job. The ceremony in the canyon came first, and it was conducted by an elder named Red Pipe, who was 91 years old and had married so many people over the decades that he had developed a ceremony that was exactly as long as it needed to be, and no longer. Which I respected. Stanton River stood beside Cece. My nephew, who was 20 by then, and had become fond of Cece in the way young people become fond of people who treat them like they have something worth listening to, stood beside me. The band was there. The canyon in June was something. The water was running clear, and the grass was deep green, and the walls of the canyon caught the light in the afternoon in a particular way that made everything glow slightly. And even people who were not given to being moved by such things were quiet and still, in a way that had something to do with more than just the ceremony. Red Pipe said the words. He said them in Lakota, and then he said a portion of them in the English Cece knew, which was considerable by then. When he said the part about choosing, the part about 2 people placing their hands in each other's keeping, Cece took my hand and held it with both of hers, and she looked at me the way she'd been looking at me since the porch in Harwick. That straight-on look that does not flinch and does not perform and does not ask for anything except to be received. I held her hands. I looked back at her. Red Pipe finished his words, and there was a moment of quiet, and then the people around us made the sound that people make when something right has happened. And Stanton River said something that made several of the women laugh, and my nephew looked pleased with himself for no clear reason. And Cece turned to me and said, low enough that only I heard it, "There you are," like she'd been looking and had found me, like I had finally come into focus. I don't know if I can tell you what that did to me. I was 41 years old. I had been carrying 63 people for 6 years. I had been seen as a threat and a problem and an inconvenience to be managed for most of my adult life by most of the white world. I had lost my first wife. I had ridden through years of the accumulated weight of doors shut and papers waved and guns laid across saddles. There you are. I put my hand on her face. She leaned into it. That was the warm physical moment that the photograph shows, though the photograph shows it a little later. Outside the cabin door, she is leaning into my hand and looking at me. And I am looking at her, and neither of us is performing anything. We have both been found by a person who looked clearly and chose without reservation. I said at the beginning that this story is about what happened between me and Cece, and I want to keep it there. I don't want to tell you what happened with Creel, or with the territorial disputes, or with the wider world pushing in on us the way it always pushed, because that is a longer and harder story, and this is not that story. What I want to tell you is the end of this story, which is not really an end, but a place I've chosen to stop. The autumn after we married, When the cold was coming back down from the high ground, and we were making the preparations that need, making the stacking, and the storing, and the tending, and the planning. There was an evening when we sat outside the cabin, together and watched the sun go down on the canyon walls. Cece had her hand on my arm, not resting it, holding it. The canyon was gold, and then orange, and then red, and then dark. And the colors moved down the wall as the sun dropped, and there was a moment right at the end when the very top of the east wall held the last light, and everything else was in shadow. And in that moment, the stone glowed almost white. She said, "I think we're going to be all right." I looked at the glowing stone. I thought about the 63 people I was responsible for. I thought about the winter ahead, which would be hard but manageable. I thought about what I knew about this land, this canyon, these waters. I thought about what she knew, and what she'd shown me she could do, and what she'd said to Creel in the canyon mouth, and what she'd said to me in April, and what Red Pipe had said in June. I thought about that look. "There you are." "Yes," I said. "I think we are." The last light went off the stone. The canyon was dark, and the sky above it still held some blue. And in that blue, the first stars were starting. She put her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. We sat there until it was full dark, and the stars were out in their numbers, and the creek kept running, and the canyon held us, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.